The day was ordinary, or so it seemed. The bustling city streets were alive with the usual symphony of car horns, chattering crowds, and the distant hum of construction. The sun hung lazily in the sky, casting a warm, golden hue over everything it touched. Amidst this everyday chaos, a man of stature and wealth moved with purpose. This was a man who had everything: money, power, influence. His life was a series of meetings, deals, and decisions that shaped the world around him. Yet for all his success, there was a void, a sense of something missing, though he would never admit it. His name was Daniel, and he was known throughout the city as a business magnate, a titan of industry who had built his empire from the ground up. To many, he was a figure of admiration and envy, the epitome of the self-made man. But beneath the surface of his well-polished exterior, Daniel was a man consumed by his work, his life meticulously planned out to the last second, leaving little room for anything outside the realm of his control. Today was just another day in that tightly wound schedule. Daniel was on his way to an important meeting, his mind already racing with strategies and figures. The familiar buzz of his phone, a constant companion as he moved through the crowded streets. His chauffeur had dropped him off a few blocks away from his destination, and he had decided to walk the remaining distance, more out of a desire to clear his head than any need for exercise. As he weaved through the throng of pedestrians, something caught his eye. It was subtle at first, just a flicker of movement in the periphery of his vision, something he would normally have ignored. But for some reason, he turned his head, his gaze drawn to a small, almost hidden figure in the shadows of a nearby alley. There, huddled against the cold, unforgiving stone of a building, was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old, her clothes tattered and dirty, her hair matted and unkempt. She was clutching something to her chest, something wrapped in a threadbare blanket. Daniel squinted, his curiosity piqued. The city was no stranger to poverty and homelessness, and he had seen his share of beggars and street children. But there was something different about this girl, something that stirred a long-buried emotion within him, that as he drew closer, he could see the strain on her small face, the way her eyes darted nervously around as if searching for something or someone. Her grip tightened on the bundle in her arms, and for the first time, Daniel realized it was another child, a baby, barely a few months old, nestled against her chest. His heart skipped a beat. The sight of these two children, abandoned and alone, struck him with a force he hadn't anticipated. There was a vulnerability in the girl's eyes, a silent plea for help that cut through the noise of the city, reaching deep into a part of him that he had long forgotten existed. For a moment, he hesitated. This was not his world, not his problem. He was a man of action, of logic and reason, not emotion. His life was built on decisions that were calculated and measured, every step planned with precision. And yet, here he was, standing frozen in the middle of a busy street, unable to tear his gaze away from this tragic scene. Something within him stirred, an unfamiliar tug at the edges of his conscience. He could turn away, continue on his path, and no one would think less of him. It would be easy, so easy, to dismiss this as just another sad story in a city full of them. But something held him there, rooted to the spot, as if an invisible force was pulling him towards the girl. He took a step closer, his heart pounding in his chest. The girl looked up, her eyes meeting his. There was fear in those eyes, but also a flicker of hope, as if she sensed that this man, this stranger, might be different from the countless others who had passed her by without a second glance. "Are you all right?" The words came out before he could stop them, his voice softer than he intended. The girl blinked, as if she wasn't sure she had heard him correctly. She didn't respond, her gaze shifting back to the bundle in her arms. Daniel followed her gaze and saw the baby's tiny face, pale and gaunt, its breathing shallow and labored. A surge of protectiveness welled up within him, surprising him with its intensity. "What's your name?" he asked, crouching down to her level, trying to make his voice as gentle as possible. "Lily," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the din of the city. "Lily," he repeated, as if trying to anchor himself to this moment, to this small, fragile life before him. "And who is this?" He gestured to the baby. "My brother," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "His name is Ben." Daniel nodded, his mind racing. He knew he couldn't just leave them here, not like this. But what could he do? His life was a world away from this, a world of boardrooms and high-rise apartments, of luxury and excess. He wasn't equipped to handle something like this, to take responsibility for 2 abandoned children. But as he looked into Lily's eyes, he knew he had no choice. There was something in those eyes, a resilience, a strength that belied her young age. She had been through so much already, and yet she had survived, for herself and for her brother. He couldn't turn his back on that. "Lily," he said softly, "I want to help you. Can you tell me where your parents are?" Her face crumpled, tears welling up in her eyes. "They're gone," she choked out. "They left us. I don't know where they are. They said they'd be back, but they never came." The words hit Daniel like a punch to the gut. He had heard stories like this before, but hearing it from the mouth of a child, seeing the raw pain in her eyes, made it all too real. He couldn't imagine what she had been through, the fear and uncertainty that must have haunted her every day. But he didn't let his emotions show. Instead, he took a deep breath, his mind already working on a plan. "All right," he said, his voice steady. "We'll figure this out together, okay? But first, let's get you and Ben somewhere safe." Lily looked at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of hope and disbelief. "You mean it? You're really going to help us?" "Yes," he said firmly, the resolve in his voice surprising even himself. "I'm going to help you." As the words left his mouth, he felt a shift within him, as if something had been unlocked, something he had kept hidden away for far too long. This was more than just a chance encounter, more than just a moment of charity. This was a turning point, a moment that would change everything. Though he couldn't yet see how, Daniel stood up and extended his hand to Lily, who hesitated for a moment before taking it. Her small hand felt so fragile in his, a stark contrast to the firm grip he usually reserved for business deals and contracts. But in that moment, it felt right, like the first real connection he had made in a long time. With his free hand, he reached for his phone, dialing a number he knew by heart. "James, I need you to pick me up," he said when the call connected. "I've had a change of plans." As he spoke, he couldn't help but glance down at Lily and Ben, the weight of his decision settling on his shoulders. This was just the beginning, the first step on a path he had never expected to take. But as he looked into Lily's eyes, he knew it was a path he was meant to follow. For the first time in a long while, Daniel felt something other than the cold, calculated precision of his everyday life. He felt a warmth, a spark of something greater than himself, something that went beyond wealth and power. And as he led Lily and Ben out of the shadows and into the light, he knew that his life would never be the same again. As Daniel guided Lily and her brother, Ben, toward the safety of his waiting car, the city seemed to recede into the background. The cacophony of noise, the rush of pedestrians, and the imposing buildings all blurred, leaving only the fragile figures of the children in his care. The weight of the responsibility he had just taken on began to settle in, but Daniel knew there was no turning back. The thought of leaving them behind, alone and vulnerable, was unthinkable. The car, a sleek black luxury sedan, pulled up to the curb, and James, Daniel's loyal driver and confidant, stepped out, his expression one of controlled concern. James had worked for Daniel for years, long enough to recognize the rare moments when his employer's stoic demeanor cracked. And this was one of those moments. "Sir," James began, but Daniel waved him off, not wanting to discuss the gravity of the situation in front of the children. "Just get us home, James," Daniel said, his voice firm, but laced with an undercurrent of unease. James nodded, his eyes flicking to Lily and Ben before he opened the back door for them. As Daniel helped Lily into the car, he noticed how tightly she clutched Ben, her arms wrapped protectively around the infant as if she feared he might be taken from her. There was something heartbreaking about the way she held onto her brother, her small body tense with the weight of her responsibility. It was clear that despite her young age, Lily had taken on the role of caregiver, and the strain of it was etched in every line of her face. Once they were all inside the car, the door closed with a soft click, sealing them in a cocoon of leather and silence. The contrast between the chaotic streets and the serene interior of the car was stark, almost surreal. Daniel had spent countless hours in this very car, conducting business calls, reviewing documents, planning his next move. But today, the world outside the tinted windows seemed far removed from the reality within. Lily sat quietly beside him, her eyes darting nervously around the opulent interior. Daniel noticed how she avoided looking directly at him, her gaze focused on the baby in her arms. Ben had fallen asleep, his tiny chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. The silence was heavy, filled with unspoken questions and the weight of the unknown. "Are you hungry, Lily?" Daniel asked gently, breaking the silence. He realized he had no idea when the last time the children had eaten, and the thought sent a pang of guilt through him. Lily looked up at him, her eyes wide with surprise, as if she hadn't expected such a question. "Yes," she whispered, her voice small. Daniel nodded and reached for the intercom. "James, stop by a place where we can get some food. Something for the kids." "Yes, sir," came the prompt reply. As the car moved smoothly through the streets, Daniel leaned back in his seat, trying to process the situation. His mind, usually sharp and focused, was now a whirlwind of emotions and thoughts. How could two children be left to fend for themselves in a city like this? What had happened to their parents? The questions swirled in his mind, each one more troubling than the last. After a few minutes, the car pulled up to a small, unassuming cafe that Daniel had frequented on rare occasions when he wanted a break from the formalities of his usual haunts. It was a quiet place, known for its homemade sandwiches and warm atmosphere. James got out to fetch the food, leaving Daniel alone with the children once more. As they waited, Daniel turned to Lily, his gaze softening as he studied her. She was so young, yet there was a maturity in her eyes that spoke of experiences far beyond her years. He had seen that look before in the eyes of people who had been through unimaginable hardships. But to see it in a child was something that unsettled him deeply. "Lily," he began carefully, "can you tell me what happened? How did you and Ben end up on the street?" Lily's grip on her brother tightened, and for a moment, Daniel thought she might not answer. But then she took a deep breath, as if gathering her courage, and began to speak. "It was a few weeks ago," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "We were living with our parents in a small apartment. It wasn't much, but it was home. Then one day, they said we had to leave. They didn't tell me why, just that it wasn't safe to stay there anymore." Daniel listened intently, his heart sinking with each word. He could only imagine the fear and confusion Lily must have felt, being uprooted from the only home she had ever known. "They took us to a shelter," Lily continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was loud and crowded, and Ben cried a lot. I tried to keep him quiet, but it was hard. Our parents left us there, saying they would come back for us, but they never did." Her words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of abandonment. Daniel's jaw clenched as he tried to keep his emotions in check. He had heard stories like this before, stories of families torn apart by poverty, addiction, or worse. But hearing it from Lily, seeing the pain in her eyes, made it all the more real. "What did you do when they didn't come back?" Daniel asked gently, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Lily looked down at Ben, her expression one of deep sadness. I waited. I waited for days, but they never came. The people at the shelter were nice at first, but then they said I had to leave because I couldn't take care of Ben on my own. They said they would find us a foster home, but I didn't want to be separated from him." Her voice broke, and Daniel could see the tears welling up in her eyes. "So, I took Ben and left. I didn't know where to go. I just wanted to keep him safe." Daniel's chest tightened as he listened to her story. The thought of this little girl wandering the streets alone with her baby brother, with no one to turn to, filled him with a deep sense of injustice. How could this have happened? How could a child be left to fend for herself in a world so cruel and unforgiving? "And how long have you been out there?" he asked, his voice strained. Lily shrugged, her small shoulders slumping under the weight of her burden. "I don't know. A few days, maybe? It's hard to keep track. I tried to find food, but it was hard, and Ben was always hungry. I didn't know what to do." The tears she had been holding back finally spilled over, and she buried her face in Ben's blanket, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Daniel felt a lump form in his throat as he watched her cry. He wanted to comfort her, to tell her that everything would be okay, but he knew that words alone wouldn't be enough. What this child needed was more than just reassurance. She needed someone who could take action, someone who could change her reality to that moment. James returned with a bag of sandwiches and drinks, his expression grave as he took in the scene. He handed the food to Daniel, who thanked him quietly before turning his attention back to Lily. "Here, Lily," Daniel said softly, offering her a sandwich. "Eat something. You need to keep your strength up." Lily wiped her tears with the back of her hand and took the sandwich, her hands trembling slightly. She unwrapped it carefully, as if afraid it might disappear if she wasn't careful. Daniel watched as she took a small bite, chewing slowly, her eyes darting around as if she still couldn't quite believe she was safe. Daniel handed another sandwich to James, who gently took Ben from Lily's arms, allowing her to eat more comfortably. The baby stirred briefly but didn't wake, his tiny face peaceful in sleep. James cradled him with the practiced ease of someone who had raised children of his own, and Daniel felt a pang of gratitude for his driver's quiet support. As Lily ate, Daniel's mind raced with questions. What had driven her parents to abandon their children? Was it desperation, fear, or something darker? He knew that finding the answers would be difficult, but he also knew that he couldn't rest until he had done everything in his power to help these children. When Lily had finished her sandwich, she looked up at Daniel, her expression a mixture of gratitude and lingering fear. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice trembling. "You're welcome, Lily," Daniel replied, forcing a small smile. "You don't have to worry anymore. You and Ben are safe now." Lily nodded, though the doubt in her eyes remained. Daniel knew it would take time for her to fully trust him, to believe that she and her brother were truly safe. But he was determined to earn that trust, no matter what it took. The car ride continued in silence, the tension slowly ebbing away as they drove through the city. Daniel's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, plans forming and dissolving as he tried to figure out the best course of action. He knew that this was just the beginning, that there were many challenges ahead. But for now, his focus was on getting Lily and Ben somewhere they could rest, somewhere they could begin to heal. Eventually, the car pulled up to the entrance of Daniel's building, a sleek, modern structure that stood in stark contrast to the grim reality Lily and Ben had been living in. As the car came to a stop, Daniel turned to Lily, his expression serious but kind. "Lily, I want you to know that you and Ben are going to stay with me for now," he said, choosing his words carefully. "I have plenty of room, and I'll make sure you're taken care of. We'll figure out what to do next, but for now, all you need to worry about is getting some rest." Lily's eyes widened in surprise, and for a moment, Daniel thought she might refuse. But then she nodded slowly, a look of relief washing over her features. "Okay," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Daniel smiled reassuringly and stepped out of the car, helping Lily and James with Ben. As they made their way into the building, Daniel's thoughts were already racing ahead, planning the next steps. He would need to contact someone who could help, someone who knew how to navigate the legal system, who could ensure that Lily and Ben were protected. But that was a problem for tomorrow. Tonight, his priority was making sure these children felt safe and secure, that they knew they weren't alone anymore. As they entered his apartment, a spacious and meticulously decorated space that suddenly felt too large and too empty, Daniel felt a strange sense of anticipation. This was a turning point, not just for Lily and Ben, but for him as well. He had spent so many years focused on his career, on building his empire, that he had forgotten what it meant to truly care for someone, to make a difference in someone's life. But as he watched Lily settle onto the plush couch, Ben cradled in her arms, he knew that he had found something he hadn't even realized he was searching for. And for the first time in a long while, Daniel felt a sense of purpose that went beyond business and wealth. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He would do everything in his power to protect these children, to give them the life they deserved. And in doing so, he might just find the answers to the questions that had been haunting him for so long. But that journey was only just beginning. For now, they needed rest. And so did he. As the city outside continued its relentless pace, Daniel found himself caught in a rare moment of stillness. The discovery of Lily and Ben had shattered the careful order of his life. But in the chaos, he had found something worth fighting for. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel was ready to fight. The vast expanse of Daniel's apartment was eerily quiet as the night settled in, casting long shadows across the meticulously designed space. The polished marble floors, the tasteful art adorning the walls, the sleek, modern furniture, everything about the place screamed wealth and power. But tonight, as Daniel stood by the large floor-to-ceiling windows, gazing out at the city skyline, the trappings of his success felt oddly empty. In the stillness, Daniel could hear the soft breathing of Lily and Ben, who had finally fallen asleep in the guest room. It had taken some time to calm them down, especially Lily, whose anxiety had been palpable. The fear in her eyes had slowly faded as exhaustion took over, but Daniel knew it would take much more than a single night of safety to erase the trauma she had endured. The weight of what he had taken on was beginning to settle on Daniel's shoulders. He had made a promise to protect these children, to give them a chance at a better life, but the enormity of that commitment was only now sinking in. He had never been responsible for anyone other than himself. His life had been meticulously controlled, every decision calculated, every risk measured. But this was different. For the first time in years, Daniel felt a sense of vulnerability, an unfamiliar emotion that gnawed at the edges of his usually unshakable confidence. How could he, a man whose world revolved around profit margins and market shares, possibly know how to care for two children who had lost everything? The questions haunted him, swirling in his mind as he watched the city lights flicker in the distance. As the hours passed, Daniel found himself pacing the length of his apartment, his thoughts racing. He had built his empire on his ability to make quick, decisive choices, to see opportunities where others saw obstacles. But this situation was unlike anything he had ever encountered. There were no clear answers, no simple solutions. Every decision he made from this point forward would have real, tangible consequences for Lily and Ben. And that realization terrified him. He stopped by the guest room door, listening to the quiet. James had offered to stay the night, to help in any way he could, but Daniel had insisted that he go home. This was something he needed to figure out on his own, without the buffer of his usual support system. He needed to face the reality of the situation head-on, to understand the full scope of what he had committed to. The door creaked softly as he pushed it open, revealing the small, slumbering forms of Lily and Ben. They were curled up together on the large bed, Ben nestled against Lily's chest, his tiny hand clutching the fabric of her shirt. Even in sleep, Lily's expression was tense, her brow furrowed, as if she was still carrying the weight of the world on her small shoulders. Daniel's heart ached at the sight. How had it come to this? How had a little girl and her baby brother ended up alone and abandoned, with no one to care for them? The thought filled him with a sense of injustice, a burning anger that he rarely allowed himself to feel. But beneath that anger was a deeper, more unsettling emotion. Guilt that he had spent his life accumulating wealth, climbing the ladder of success, all while insulating himself from the harsh realities faced by those less fortunate. He had donated to charities, attended fundraisers, written checks to causes that tugged at his heartstrings. But when had he ever truly made a difference? When had he ever really looked beyond the walls of his world to see the struggles of others? The realization was a bitter pill to swallow. For all his success, for all his accomplishments, Daniel had been living in a bubble, shielded from the raw, painful truth of the world outside his penthouse. And now, faced with the undeniable evidence of that truth, he felt a deep, gnawing sense of responsibility that he couldn't just throw money at this problem and hope it would go away. He couldn't delegate this to someone else or find a way to profit from it. This was real, and it demanded more from him than he had ever been willing to give. Daniel knew he had to make a decision, one that would alter the course of not only his life, but also the lives of Lily and Ben. He could try to find their parents, though the chances of success seemed slim. He could contact social services, but the thought of separating the children or placing them in a system that might fail them filled him with dread. Or he could take them in himself, commit to being the guardian they desperately needed, despite his complete lack of experience in such matters. But what did he know about raising children? About providing the kind of emotional support and stability they needed? The idea seemed absurd, almost laughable. He was a businessman, not a father. And yet, the thought of handing them over to strangers, of abandoning them as their parents had, was even more unthinkable. That he needed advice, guidance from someone who understood these kinds of situations better than he did. But who could he turn to? The people in his world were as insulated as he was, more concerned with profits and prestige than with the kind of decisions that really mattered. And while James was loyal and wise in his own way, this was beyond even his experience. That as the night dragged on, Daniel found himself sinking deeper into uncertainty. Every scenario he considered seemed fraught with complications, with potential pitfalls he wasn't equipped to navigate. The weight of responsibility was crushing, and for the first time in his life, Daniel felt truly overwhelmed. He knew he couldn't put off the decision for long. Lily and Ben couldn't stay in limbo, waiting for him to sort out his thoughts. They needed stability, security, a sense of permanence in a world that had been anything but kind to them. And as much as Daniel wanted to find the perfect solution, he was beginning to realize that there might not be one. Life was messy, complicated, full of risks that couldn't always be mitigated or managed. But if there was one thing Daniel had learned in his years of building a business empire, it was that sometimes you had to take a leap of faith. You had to make the best decision you could with the information you had, even if it meant stepping into the unknown. That as dawn began to break, casting a soft, golden light over the city, Daniel felt a sense of clarity begin to emerge from the fog of his thoughts. He couldn't predict the future, couldn't guarantee that everything would turn out perfectly, but he could make a commitment, a promise to do everything in his power to give Lily and Ben the life they deserved. That he walked over to the bed, standing over the sleeping children, and made a silent vow to them. He would protect them, care for them, and ensure that they never had to face the horrors of abandonment again. It wouldn't be easy, and he would undoubtedly make mistakes along the way, but he was determined to try. The decision made, Daniel felt a strange sense of peace settle over him, mingled with the anxiety that still lingered at the edges of his mind. He had taken the first step, and while the path ahead was uncertain, it was one he was ready to walk. That as he left the guest room and headed to his own bedroom, Daniel knew that the real challenges were only just beginning. He would need to learn quickly, to adapt to a role he had never imagined for himself. But for the first time in years, Daniel felt like he was doing something that truly mattered, something that went beyond the pursuit of wealth and success. The sun had fully risen by the time Daniel finally laid down to rest, his mind still buzzing with plans and possibilities. But despite the uncertainty, despite the fear of the unknown, he felt a sense of purpose that had long been missing from his life. He closed his eyes, knowing that the days ahead would be difficult, but also feeling a flicker of hope, a hope that he could give Lily and Ben the future they deserved, and in doing so, find a new direction for his own life as well. Morning came far too quickly. Daniel woke with a start, his mind already racing with the tasks that lay ahead. He had made a decision, but now came the hard part, turning that decision into reality. He needed to act quickly, to put plans in place that would ensure Lily and Ben were safe and cared for. But first, he needed to make sure they understood what was happening, that they knew they weren't alone anymore. He dressed quickly and made his way to the kitchen, where he began preparing breakfast, a simple task that felt monumental given the circumstances. As the smell of cooking filled the apartment, Daniel found himself thinking about how much his life had changed in just a few short hours. Yesterday, he had been focused on business deals, on expanding his empire. Today, his priorities had shifted in ways he hadn't thought possible. Lily appeared in the doorway, rubbing her eyes and looking around with a mixture of confusion and apprehension. Daniel smiled at her, trying to convey reassurance. "Good morning, Lily," he said gently. "Did you sleep well?" She nodded slowly, still clinging to the blanket she had brought with her from the guest room. "Where's Ben?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's still sleeping," Daniel replied. "I thought we could have breakfast first, and then we can talk about what's going to happen next." Lily hesitated, her eyes searching his for any sign of deceit or false promises. But all she saw was the same calm determination that had reassured her the night before. Slowly, she walked over to the table and sat down, her small hands folded in her lap. Daniel served the food and sat across from her, trying to think of the best way to explain what he had decided. He wanted to be honest with her, but he also knew that too much information could overwhelm her. In the end, he decided to keep it simple. "Lily," he began, "I know things have been really hard for you and Ben, and I want you to know that you don't have to worry anymore. I've decided that you and Ben are going to stay with me for as long as you need. I'll make sure you're safe, that you have everything you need." Lily stared at him, her expression unreadable. "Why?" she asked after a long pause. "Why are you helping us?" Daniel considered her question carefully. He knew that trust wasn't something that could be built overnight, especially not after everything she had been through. But he also knew that she deserved an honest answer. "Because I care about you," he said simply. "I don't want to see you or Ben suffer any more than you already have. And because, well, sometimes people come into your life for a reason. I don't know what that reason is yet, but I know that I can't just turn my back on you. I want to help if you'll let me." Lily looked down at her plate, her expression thoughtful. Daniel watched her carefully, trying to gauge her reaction. He knew that she was processing a lot of information, that she was probably scared and unsure of what the future held. But he also saw a glimmer of hope in her eyes, a tiny spark that hadn't been there before. "Okay," she said finally, her voice small but steady. "We can stay." Daniel felt a wave of relief wash over him. It was a small victory, but it was a start. He smiled at her, feeling a warmth in his chest that he hadn't felt in a long time. "Good," he said, his voice gentle. "We'll take it one day at a time, okay? And if you ever have any questions, or if you're scared, you can talk to me. I'm here for you, Lily. Always." She nodded, a tentative smile playing on her lips. It was a small, fragile thing, but it was there, and that was enough for Daniel. For now, it was enough that as they finished breakfast, Daniel's mind was already turning to the practicalities of the situation. There were so many things to consider: legalities, logistics, ensuring that Lily and Ben had everything they needed. But as he looked at Lily, who was finally starting to relax in her chair, he knew that they would face those challenges together. For the first time in years, Daniel felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. The road ahead was uncertain, full of unknowns, but he was ready to face it. He had made his decision, and he would stand by it, no matter what came next. The day stretched out before them, full of possibilities. And for the first time, Daniel felt like he was ready to embrace those possibilities, to let go of the rigid control he had always clung to and allow life to take him where it would. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain: he wouldn't face it alone. Lily and Ben were a part of his life now, and together, they would forge a new path. One that was built on trust, care, and the simple, unshakable belief that they could create a better future together. As the sun rose higher in the sky, casting its warm light across the city, Daniel felt a sense of peace settle over him. He had made his decision, and he knew it was the right one. The weight of uncertainty was still there, but it was no longer a burden. It was a challenge, one that he was ready to meet head-on. For the first time in a long while, Daniel felt truly alive, and that, he realized, was worth more than all the wealth and power in the world. Daniel had never imagined how much his life could change in such a short time. When he first stumbled upon Lily and Ben, abandoned and alone, he had acted on instinct, driven by a deep sense of responsibility he hadn't felt in years. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, Daniel realized that taking them had been just the beginning of a much larger journey. One that would test every aspect of his character and force him to redefine who he was. The initial days were a whirlwind of emotions, legal procedures, and adjustments. Daniel had to navigate a world that was entirely foreign to him. Social services, guardianship laws, and the day-to-day realities of caring for two traumatized children. He quickly learned that while his wealth and influence could open doors, they couldn't solve every problem. The challenges he faced were personal, deeply emotional, and required a level of patience and empathy he had never had to cultivate before. Lily was a complicated case. At just 10 years old, she had experienced more hardship than most people could imagine. Her trust in adults was shattered, her sense of safety eroded. Daniel knew that earning her trust would take time, but he was determined to show her that she wasn't alone anymore, that she could count on him to protect her and Ben. The process was slow and fraught with setbacks. There were nights when Lily would wake up screaming, haunted by nightmares that Daniel couldn't chase away. There were days when she would withdraw completely, refusing to speak or even look at him, lost in a world of her own making. And there were moments when her fear would manifest as anger. Anger at the world, at her parents, and sometimes even at Daniel himself. But through it all, Daniel remained patient. He knew that the walls Lily had built around herself wouldn't come down easily, but he was willing to wait as long as it took. Ben, on the other hand, was too young to understand the full extent of what had happened. At barely a year old, he was more adaptable, more open to the love and care that Daniel offered. But even he bore the scars of abandonment. He clung to Lily like a lifeline, his tiny hands always reaching for her when she wasn't close enough. It broke Daniel's heart to see how much responsibility Lily felt for her baby brother, how she had been forced to grow up too quickly, to assume a role that no child should have to bear. As Daniel settled into his new role as a guardian, he found himself grappling with doubts and insecurities he hadn't faced in years. Was he doing enough? Was he making the right decisions for Lily and Ben? Could he really give them the life they deserved? These questions plagued him, especially in the quiet moments when the weight of his new responsibilities felt almost too much to bear. But as the weeks passed, Daniel began to see small signs of progress. Lily started to open up, if only a little. She began to ask questions about the world, about the things she didn't understand. She started to express her opinions, to assert herself in ways that showed she was beginning to feel safe. Ben, too, was thriving. He was growing stronger, more confident, his laughter filling the once quiet apartment with a sense of warmth and life that had been missing for so long. Daniel realized that for all the challenges, there were also moments of joy, moments that made everything worth it. The first time Lily smiled at him, a real, genuine smile that reached her eyes. The sound of Ben's laughter as he learned to take his first steps, wobbling uncertainly before collapsing into Daniel's arms. These were the moments that made him believe that he could do this, that he could be the father figure they needed. But Daniel also knew that he couldn't do it alone. He reached out to professionals, therapists, counselors, and child development experts who could help Lily and Ben navigate their trauma and adjust to their new lives. He enrolled Lily in a private school, one that offered small class sizes and personalized attention, hoping to give her the educational opportunities she had missed out on. He also hired a full-time nanny, not to replace him, but to provide additional support and care when he was at work. Through all of this, Daniel's own life continued to evolve. His work, once the sole focus of his existence, began to take a back seat to his new responsibilities. He still managed his business empire, still made important decisions, and closed major deals, but his priorities had shifted. His mornings were now spent getting Lily ready for school, making sure Ben was fed and happy before heading to the office. His evenings were dedicated to helping Lily with her homework, reading bedtime stories to Ben, and ensuring that both children felt loved and secure. The transformation was gradual, almost imperceptible at first, but it was happening. Daniel was changing, growing into a role he had never anticipated, but was slowly learning to embrace. He found that he was no longer driven by the pursuit of wealth or power, but by a deeper, more meaningful desire to make a difference in the lives of these two children. The satisfaction he once derived from business success was now replaced by the simple joy of seeing Lily laugh, of hearing Ben call him Dada for the first time. But the journey wasn't without its setbacks. There were days when Daniel felt overwhelmed, when the pressures of his dual roles as a CEO and a guardian threatened to consume him. There were moments when Lily would retreat into herself, when the progress they had made seemed to vanish, leaving Daniel to wonder if he was really making a difference at all. But each time he felt himself wavering, he would look at Lily and Ben, at the trust they were slowly beginning to place in him, and he would find the strength to keep going. One of the biggest challenges came when Daniel realized that, despite his best efforts, he couldn't shield Lily and Ben from the world forever. They needed to learn how to navigate life outside the safety of his apartment, to build relationships with others, to trust in the kindness of strangers. It was a daunting prospect, especially for Lily, who had learned the hard way that the world could be a dangerous, unpredictable place. Daniel knew that he needed to help Lily rebuild her sense of self-worth, to show her that she was capable of more than just surviving. He encouraged her to pursue her interests, to try new things, even if they scared her. He signed her up for art classes where she could express herself creatively, and for a martial arts program where she could build confidence and learn self-discipline. He also made sure to spend quality time with her, taking her on weekend outings to museums, parks, and the occasional amusement park, always careful to respect her boundaries and move at her pace. That it wasn't easy, and there were times when Lily would resist, when the fear of the unknown would cause her to retreat into herself. But Daniel was patient, always reassuring her that she was safe, that he would never force her to do anything she wasn't ready for. And gradually, over time, Lily began to open up, to take tentative steps towards reclaiming her childhood. One day, after months of consistent encouragement and support, Lily surprised Daniel with a simple but powerful gesture. She brought him a drawing she had made in her art class, a picture of the three of them, herself, Ben, and Daniel, standing together in front of a house. The house was bright and colorful, with flowers in the yard and a sun shining overhead. In the picture, they were all smiling, holding hands, and looking out at the world together. Daniel was speechless. He looked at the drawing, then at Lily, who was watching him nervously, her fingers twisting the hem of her shirt. "It's us," she said quietly, as if afraid he wouldn't understand. "It's our family." Tears welled up in Daniel's eyes as he carefully took the drawing from her, treating it like the precious gift it was. He knelt down in front of her, pulling her into a gentle hug. "It's beautiful, Lily," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." Lily hugged him back, and for the first time, Daniel felt the full weight of what they had built together, a family. It was a word that had once seemed foreign to him, something he had never imagined for himself. But now, it was the most important thing in his life. That as the months turned into a year, the transformation in both Daniel and the children became more pronounced. Lily was thriving in school, making friends and discovering new interests. Ben was growing into a happy, curious toddler, full of energy and life. And Daniel had found a sense of fulfillment and purpose that he had never known before. The business continued to flourish, but it was no longer the center of Daniel's world. His priorities had shifted, and he had learned to delegate more, trusting his capable team to manage the day-to-day operations while he focused on what truly mattered. He still enjoyed the challenges of the business world, but his heart was now fully invested in the lives of Lily and Ben. And then, one day, something unexpected happened, something that would change everything once again. Daniel received a call from a social worker, informing him that Lily and Ben's biological parents had been located. They were alive, but they were not in a position to care for the children. The social worker explained that the parents had been involved in criminal activities and were facing long prison sentences. They had expressed no interest in reclaiming custody of the children and had signed over their parental rights. Daniel was stunned. He had always known that this day might come, that Lily and Ben's parents could reappear at any moment, but he hadn't expected it to happen so soon. The news brought a mix of emotions. Relief that the children were no longer in danger from their past, but also a deep sadness for the loss of what could have been. But as Daniel processed the news, he realized something else, something that filled him with a sense of hope and resolve. The way was now clear for him to legally adopt Lily and Ben, to make their family official in the eyes of the law. It was a step he had been hesitant to take before, unsure of whether it was what the children wanted or needed. But now, with their biological parents out of the picture, Daniel knew that he had to act. He approached Lily with the news carefully, explaining everything in a way that she could understand. To his relief, Lily seemed more curious than upset, asking questions about what it would mean for them. When Daniel finally broached the topic of adoption, he did so gently, making it clear that it was her choice, that he would support her no matter what. To his surprise, Lily didn't hesitate. "I want to stay with you," she said firmly. "I want us to be a family." The adoption process was lengthy and involved, requiring court appearances, home evaluations, and a mountain of paperwork. But through it all, Daniel remained focused, determined to see it through to the end. He knew that this was the right path for them, that it was the final step in solidifying the bond they had built. And on the day of the final court hearing, Daniel dressed in his best suit, Lily in a new dress, and Ben in a tiny tuxedo that made him look like a miniature version of his guardian. They stood together in the courtroom, surrounded by friends and supporters, as the judge reviewed the case. When the judge finally announced her decision, granting the adoption and making Daniel the legal father of Lily and Ben. The courtroom erupted in applause. Daniel felt a wave of emotion wash over him. Relief, joy, and an overwhelming sense of pride. He looked down at Lily, who was beaming up at him, and then at Ben, who was clapping along with everyone else, even though he didn't fully understand what was happening. "Congratulations," the judge said, smiling warmly at them. "You are now officially a family." As they left the courtroom, Daniel felt like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. They had come so far, faced so many challenges, but they had made it. They were a family, in every sense of the word. The journey that had begun on that cold, rainy night when Daniel found Lily and Ben on the street had finally come full circle. He had gone from being a lonely, isolated man, consumed by his work, to a father who would do anything for his children. And in the process, he had discovered something he had never known he was missing: a sense of purpose, a sense of belonging, and a love that was deeper and more fulfilling than anything he had ever experienced. And as they walked out of the courthouse and into the bright sunshine, Daniel looked down at Lily and Ben, his heart swelling with pride and love. He knew that there would still be challenges ahead, that life wouldn't always be easy, but he also knew that they would face those challenges together as a family. And that, he realized, was the greatest gift of all.